Welcome back to the second instalment of our investigation into Jimmy Savile. Previously, we discussed his ascent to national prominence and his tactics to conceal his misconduct.
In this episode, we'll examine the fallout following his death in 2011, the emergence of numerous allegations, and the subsequent inquiries that exposed a web of institutional complicity.
We'll also explore the broader implications of these events on public trust and the measures implemented to prevent such abuses of power in the future.
How did Jimmy Savile, now recognised as one of Britain's most prolific sex offenders, manage to cultivate an image of benevolence and philanthropy for so long? The answer lies, in part, in the psychology of groupthink.
Groupthink occurs when the desire for harmony or conformity within a group results in irrational or dysfunctional decision-making. In Savile's case, his celebrity status and charitable endeavours created a collective blind spot, causing many to overlook or dismiss warning signs.
During his lifetime, Savile was lauded for his charitable work. He raised an estimated £40 million for various causes, including Stoke Mandeville Hospital and the National Spinal Injuries Centre. His efforts earned him numerous accolades, including an OBE and knighthoods from both British and papal authorities.
Public figures and institutions were quick to praise him. Margaret Thatcher once described his work as marvellous, and he was known to have spent multiple New Year's Eves at Chequers with her family.
I thought you were going to fix my getting into number 10.
I've already done so, but I was going to see you privately about that because I wouldn't want too many people to realise how I'd done it.
Prince Charles, now King Charles III, also sought his advice on public relations matters.
When I think that it costs £10 million, how on earth can you raise £10 million in 3 years?
The media played a significant role in perpetuating his positive image. Obituaries and tributes highlighted his eccentricity and charitable contributions, often glossing over or ignoring allegations and rumours that had surfaced over the years.
In death, as in life, Jimmy Savile was simply flamboyant, and so it seems fitting that his send-off should be a similarly glittering affair. Goodness gracious, lying in state in the bar of Leeds' Queen's Hotel next to the train station, Sir Jimmy Savile making his final journey in a satin gold coffin. As it happens, next to the last cigar he ever smoked. His fans, guys and gals, queuing up to pay their respects.
It's exactly what he would have wanted. There's very few, if no, celebrities other than Sir Jimmy who could have had this wish for their send-off and the public to look at and go, yeah, actually that's a great idea.
Moving, it choked you up. It was more than what we ever expected, you know, it was tastily done and beautifully done.
This collective admiration created an environment where dissenting voices were silenced or ignored. The fear of challenging the status quo, coupled with Savile's cultivated persona, allowed him to operate with impunity.
It's a stark reminder of how societal pressures and the desire for conformity can cloud judgment, enabling individuals like Savile to exploit their positions of trust.
The DJ, television presenter and tireless fundraiser Sir Jimmy Savile has died. He was 84.
When Jimmy Savile died in October 2011, the BBC broadcast glowing tributes. His coffin was displayed in state. He was buried in a gold-coloured casket. The headstone read, "It was good while it lasted." But it didn't last. Within weeks of his death, the mask slipped. Allegations began to surface, quietly at first, then in a torrent. Survivors came forward, hundreds of them, men, women, children, the most vulnerable in society. Many had stayed silent for decades, too scared, ashamed, or simply not believed.
Last year, Jimmy Savile's coffin was driven past Leeds General Hospital, where he'd worked as a volunteer porter. Hospital staff joined the crowds, saying their goodbyes and applauding him. How things have changed.
Now then.
Each day brings new shocking allegations, the latest suggesting he used his charity work to gain access to the young and the vulnerable.
Public opinion turned overnight. That once loved face The cigar, the tracksuit, the fake benevolence became a symbol of betrayal. Statues were taken down. His honorary degrees were revoked. Even his gravestone was destroyed.
40 years ago, June Thornton was a patient at Leeds General Infirmary. She says she saw the TV and radio star molest a brain-damaged girl, a memory that has haunted her.
He started rubbing his hands down her arms, and then, I don't know of a nice way to put it, but he molested her. He helped himself, and she just sat there and couldn't do anything about it.
Savile raised millions for Stoke Mandeville Hospital in Buckinghamshire, but here too stories are emerging of nurses telling children to pretend to be asleep to avoid his attentions.
May God forgive me, but I hope he's in hell, because that's where he deserves to be.
That tombstone in Scarborough was removed just 3 days after being unveiled. A local stonemason volunteered to break it into pieces, but the family wanted no trace left. It was a chilling erasure of what had once been celebrated, a national ritual of repudiation.
But the truth couldn't be buried so easily. As it came to be known, the Savile scandal tore through British institutions like wildfire. The BBC, the NHS, Broadmoor, Stoke Mandeville, the Catholic Church, every place he touched was suddenly infected with suspicion, not just of him, but of everyone who let him in.
The BBC Director General has again faced uncomfortable questions about knowledge of their former star's behaviour.
I think the allegations are horrifying. And how far will this investigation go? Will you talk on TV? Will you make an apology? I already apologised on the radio this morning.
Do you think the BBC response to this has been correct?
Yes, we went straight to the police with it as soon as we had a sense of the scale of what had been going on.
And you're happy with your role in this, are you?
I'm entirely convinced that I've done all the right things, yeah.
And then came the real reckoning. The awareness that this wasn't just about one man, it was about us. How a whole society, police, press, public, let itself be fooled. Or worse, looked the other way, because he was good for ratings, because he was doing good work, because nobody wanted to be the first to say the emperor had no clothes.
You didn't tell me you were going to do that, did you, you wicked girl? Sir, 1,000 thanks for coming and being with us. Would you like to push that badge right up her nose and painting a picture of me like that?
Absolutely super, young Linny.
Isn't that fabulous?
The phrase echoed in newsrooms and living rooms across the country. How didn't we know? But the truth is, some people did know, and they were ignored, silenced or ridiculed. A review into Savile's conduct at the BBC by Dame Janet Smith concluded that Savile sexually abused at least 72 people in connection with his work at the BBC, including 8 victims who were raped. Leisha Brooks was one of Savile's victims who spoke out. Here she is telling Channel 5 News about her experiences. And her view of the Smith report? It was a whitewash.
This report does nothing. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help us victims. You admit it happened, but you've known for a long time, and you're only acting on the recommendations of the report. You should have been acting years ago. They must have known. There was too much going on. I was taken to BBC personally for 2 years by an employee of the BBC that is named in the report. He has since died as a convicted paedophile. He passed me around several people over a 2-year period. How could people have not known why an 8-year-old girl was passed around the BBC and used and abused and nobody knew? It's impossible.
And that lingering guilt has left scars. Since Savile, the UK has seen a rise in what some call moral panic by proxy. Celebrities have faced trial by media. Public figures, especially those in close contact with children or the vulnerable, are viewed through a lens of suspicion, sometimes rightly, sometimes not.
Savile's ghost haunts every conversation about safeguarding, celebrity worship, and the line between eccentricity and predation. The question it leaves behind is terrifying in its simplicity. If we got it wrong then, could we get it wrong again?
There's something uniquely unsettling about Jimmy Savile, not just what he did, but the twisted logic behind it. He wasn't simply hiding in plain sight, he seemed to live in two realities at once. On the one hand, the Good Samaritan, the fundraiser, the knight of the realm. On the other, a serial sexual predator operating across decades, abusing the most vulnerable.
He once said, and I quote, "I get my punishment every night when I go to bed." It was a chilling thing to say. Some dismissed it as cryptic eccentricity. But now, in retrospect, it reads more like a confession or self-justification.
Savile was a devout Roman Catholic. He attended Mass regularly, went on pilgrimages, and sought spiritual counsel from senior church figures. He was known to visit convents and was said to have a peculiar devotion to the Virgin Mary. A nun who met him at a shrine in Lourdes described him as deeply spiritual, humble, and generous.
And it's this duality, the holy and the horrifying, that's so disturbing. Because to him, his good works weren't just for show. There's compelling evidence that he saw his charity work as penance, that somehow by raising millions for children's hospitals and running marathons for sick kids, he was buying moral credit, paying off his sins in instalments.
He once told a journalist, "When I get up in the morning, I know I've got to do something good today or make up for what I've done the night before." Think about that. The sheer narcissism of it. As if being photographed shaking hands with the Pope could somehow cancel out years of sexual abuse.
The Lampard Review, which investigated Savile's access to NHS hospitals, pointed out this calculated contradiction. It said, Savile's volunteering and fundraising roles were part of his manipulative strategy, a smokescreen that not only enabled his abuse, but made people actively defend him.
In a way, this plays into the pathology of moral licensing. That's the psychological tendency of people to feel they've earned the right to misbehave because they've done something good. Only in Savile's case, it wasn't just bad behaviour, it was monstrous.
It raises difficult and uncomfortable questions. Was he trying to keep God on his side? Was it guilt? Or was it a well-calculated con? Maybe it was all three. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Decades of unchecked abuse enabled by a society that saw what it wanted to see. A saint, not a sinner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask my right honourable friend whether he will ensure that the full panoply of government powers is used to investigate the predatory activities of the late Mr. Jimmy Savile?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes a very important point. The allegations and what seems to have happened are completely appalling and I think are shocking the entire country.
After the revelations about Savile, the UK faced a terrifying question. How could this have happened? How could a man so openly abusing hundreds of people have escaped justice for so long? And perhaps even more chilling, how many other predators were hiding in plain sight just like him.
This is where Operation Yewtree came in, a nationwide investigation that sought to bring the survivors of Savile's abuse some measure of justice. But it quickly became clear that Savile wasn't the only monster operating in the shadows of British show business, charity work, and public life.
Launched in 2012 by the Metropolitan Police, Yewtree was designed to investigate historical sexual abuse. What started as a focused investigation into Savile soon expanded into three key strands, one dedicated to Savile himself, another to other individuals in the entertainment industry, and a third to cover any other individuals connected to Savile's circle. It became the largest and most high-profile inquiry into historical sex abuse that the UK had ever seen.
Many high-profile names were scrutinised, some were charged, others faced public investigation. The operation led to the arrest of several other celebrities and former public figures, including Gary Glitter, Rolf Harris and Max Clifford. all of whom were convicted of abuse.
There were 9 charges in total against Gary Glitter. He is being tried under his real name of Paul Francis Gadd. He has been sitting in the dock, shaking his head from side to side and muttering to himself as guilty verdict after guilty verdict has been returned here at Southwark Crown Court. Guilty of the attempted rape of a child under the age of 10, guilty of 5 indecent assaults, guilty of sex with a child under the age of 13. That one charge alone potentially carries a sentence of life imprisoned.
But the operation also raised many questions about how far the cultural rot had gone. Was Savile just the tip of the iceberg? How many more were there?
But what's particularly fascinating and disturbing is the sheer scale of the public shock. Despite decades of rumours, despite whispers, despite survivors' stories being dismissed as attention-seeking or fantasies in some cases, the full scale of the abuse was still a revelation. The operation uncovered abuse across decades and decades, leading many to question how such an entrenched culture of silence and complicity could ever have existed. Jack, you were involved with the wider regional investigations that followed Operation Yewtree, part of the domino effect created by Yewtree. I know you're limited in what you can share, but this must have been one of the most difficult cases you've ever worked on.
It was certainly one of the most challenging. The scope of the case was massive, but there was also this real pressure to get it right, not just for the victims, but for the public who'd been so profoundly shaken by what had happened.
So what do you remember about the early days of the operation? How did the team get started, especially considering, well, you were following on from a really high-profile case? What exactly were you doing?
Well, for me, there was already one operation running about a particular institution, and it was about the new team following their model and linking the 2 incident rooms so that information was shared and inquiries were not duplicated. The first step really was, it was all about listening to the victims, sometimes for the first time. They felt they'd been ignored and betrayed, and we had to reassure them that their voices were being heard. We wanted their whole story recorded on video and audio. This was an incredibly emotional thing for them, the clarity of what memories they had. And it was so profound for me when we heard that others were telling a similar story. These weren't people who knew each other and could have colluded in some way. It was compelling evidence of similar fact. There was a real sense of urgency though. Savile had already died, and the weight of the entire investigation rested on whether we could bring justice to the survivors, many of whom had been silenced for decades, and the suspects, who were now elderly or possibly dead themselves. For example, in the 1970s, we know that Savile carried out a range of abuse on students during visits to Duncroft, a boarding school in Surrey for emotionally disturbed teenage girls. Surrey police were later criticised for ignoring complaints about Savile's conduct there, in effect turning a blind eye to multiple reports of inappropriate behaviour. Karen Ward was a Duncroft student. Here she is telling ITV News about how Savile used his celebrity to lure her and her classmates into having underage sex with him.
Jimmy Savile took me out in his car one afternoon and pulled into a lay-by. This had happened before, and he had just sort of groped. There'd been a bit of snogging and groping. But this time he wanted more. He'd hinted on previous occasions that he wanted me to give him oral sex and I didn't want to, and he wanted me to have sex with him and I didn't want to. But on this occasion he promised me faithfully that if I gave him oral sex, he would take me and the other girls to London and we could be on his television show. And of course, like any 15-year-old girl, I suppose, even now, I really wanted to be on the telly and I really wanted to meet all these rich and famous people. We were in an approved school for intelligent but emotionally disturbed girls, and there we were in London on a regular basis, mixing with rich and famous people, rubbing shoulders with celebrities. Jimmy Savile had a girl on his lap and he had his hand up her skirt inside her underwear. She came from Duncroft and she was 14. We were good friends. The girl that Gary Glitter was having sex with also came from Duncroft. I think she might have been not quite 14, but we were all from Duncroft that day.
One of Jimmy Savile's many victims. Jack, were there challenges with the investigation, especially given the stature of Savile's friends and peers in the entertainment industry?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of people had been complicit in turning a blind eye to Savile's behaviour. Some were hesitant to speak out. Some of the people we interviewed had been part of a wider culture that enabled Savile's actions to go unchecked for so long. It wasn't just Savile, it was an entire system that failed the victims. That's a hard pill for many to swallow.
It seems like the culture at the time, especially within the BBC and other institutions, was very much built on protecting the powerful. Did that create any kind of resistance from the people you were investigating? And I think we should stress that your involvement was in a regional operation that followed on from the initial pump priming Operation Yewtree, one of the many regional branches, if you like, of Yewtree that were set in train by that initial investigation by the Metropolitan Police.
There were definitely those who resisted or attempted to downplay what had happened, but unfortunately there were a lot of people who were eager to make things right. The investigation was always about giving victims the justice and the voice that they deserved, even if it meant pulling down some very large and powerful people.
It's almost like a cultural reckoning, isn't it? The fact that this type of behaviour had gone on unchecked for so long almost normalised it. How did that affect you personally as an investigator?
Well, whilst it was eye-opening and disturbing, it didn't surprise me, to be honest. And when I worked at Section CID in the 80s and early 90s, we dealt with individual allegations or evidence of abuse. And this involved the NSPCC, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, was where referrals and interviews were managed. But individually, we did our best to investigate them, along with the burglaries, the assaults, the robberies and the fraud. There weren't dedicated teams on the scale that we see now. Policing was far more parochial, if that makes sense. Sadly, it also seems that the intelligence from all these isolated cases wasn't managed very well either. I think one of the things that struck me was the widespread nature of the abuse. How organisations just didn't want to believe in the rumours and the allegations. How the implications and costs of conducting robust investigations meant that they never got off the ground. What was almost as bad is that the intelligence about these abusers was not recorded properly or shared across police forces. You'll know the classic example of this, Simon, Ian Huntley, who murdered 2 young girls at the school where he was a caretaker. A job that he wouldn't have got had information about his previous behaviour been available to the local authority that employed him. It wasn't just Savile and the other individual perpetrators. It was the people around them and how the system allowed this to continue. It really made me question how much we miss in plain sight when the wrong people are in positions of power and influence. From the early years of my police career, I can imagine the reaction of senior officers in terms of their attitude and decision-making when presented with concerns about institutional sexual abuse. The investigation of sexual abuse wasn't considered a priority, even at command level, and I presume that extended to the College of Policing too.
It must have been hard to see so many families finally coming forward, but also knowing that many years had passed and they'd suffered in silence for so long.
Well, yes, but in the end, the survivors were incredibly brave. They spoke out in the hope of not just getting justice for themselves, but for those who couldn't speak. That's what kept us going.
For sure, the most powerful voices in this story are those of the survivors. Their courage in coming forward has been instrumental in exposing the truth. Take Kevin Cook, who says he was sexually abused by Jimmy Savile when he was just 9 years old. Kevin was with other members of his scout troop on a trip to the BBC studios in London to watch the filming of Jim'll Fix It. When the cameras stopped rolling, the star invited Kevin backstage to his dressing room.
That was when he said to me, "Would you still want your badge?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said to me, "You want to earn your badge?"
And I said, yeah. And then that was when it happened. He put his hand on my knee and then he started touching my leg. He tried to put his hand underneath up my leg into my shorts, which he couldn't do. And that's when he undid my zip and my clasp and pulled my shorts down. And then he started fondling me. And at the same time, he then grabbed my hand and made me touch him on top of his trousers. And at this stage, there was a knock on the door. And then somebody walked straight in, looked, saw us in there, and then walked straight back out. And then that was it, it was over. He said to me, don't you dare tell anybody about this. Nobody will believe you because I'm King Jimmy.
That clip was from an interview with CNN. Another survivor shared, "For years I thought no one would believe me, but now people are listening."
These testimonies underscore the importance of creating environments where survivors feel safe to speak out.
The Jimmy Savile case serves as a stark reminder of how power and celebrity can be misused. It highlights the need for vigilance, transparency, and accountability within institutions.
More importantly, it emphasises the importance of believing and supporting survivors.
As a former major crime detective involved in the aftermath of Operation Yewtree, I can attest to the impact of these revelations. They changed the way we approach safeguarding and historical abuse cases.
Let's take a few moments to come back to a question we often ask on Psycho Killer. Was the subject of our podcast a psychopath?
To answer that, we're going to use the Hare Psychopathy Checklist revised. The PCL-R is a psychological tool developed by Dr. Robert Hare and designed to assess the presence of psychopathic traits in individuals.
It consists of 20 items, each scored 0, 1 or 2, giving a maximum score of 40. In North America, a score of 30 or more indicates psychopathy. But some British forensic psychologists have suggested that a score of 25 or higher may be enough to flag someone as a psychopath according to UK standards.
Now, we're not psychiatrists, but we are investigators. And when you apply the checklist to Jimmy Savile's public behaviour, his patterns, and his known history, the results are chilling.
Let's break it down.
1. Glib and superficial charm. Absolutely, Savile was the master of it. That's a 2.
2. Grandiose sense of self-worth. Well, he bragged endlessly about his status, his power, his good works. That's another 2.
3. Pathological lying. Without question. 2.
Manipulative behaviour. He manipulated institutions, victims, even the press and the police. He was a master of it. That's a 2.
5. Lack of remorse or guilt. We saw no public remorse, ever. That's a 2.
6. Shallow effect, shallow emotions. He performed emotion when it served him, but nothing authentic. 2 again.
7. Callousness and lack of empathy. It's hard to think of someone who showed less empathy than Jimmy Savile. Score 2.
Number 8 on the PCL-R, parasitic lifestyle. Well, that's debatable. He worked, technically. Let's call that a 1.
9. Poor behavioural controls. Less obvious, but his compulsions were barely hidden. Let's say 1.
10. Sexual promiscuity. Extensively documented. Definitely 2.
11. Early behavioural problems. There are reports suggesting concerning behaviour from a young age. 1.
12. Lack of realistic long-term goals. No, that's not the case. He was organised and he was strategic, so that's a 0.
13. Impulsivity. Well, he was more cunning than impulsive. We'll give that a 0.
14. Irresponsibility. Hard to measure. He held down jobs. We'll say 1.
15. Failure to accept responsibility. Well, we know he denied everything and blamed everyone, so we'll score him 2.
That gives us a score of 22 out of a possible 30 just from these 15 items, and we're not even finished.
And if you complete the checklist, he lands somewhere between 28 and 32, depending on how strictly you apply the criteria.
So according to the British measure, Jimmy Savile was a psychopath. According to the US measure, borderline. Interesting that, isn't it? That was The Double Life of Jimmy Savile, an episode of Psycho Killer, shocking true crime stories. If this story shocked you, or made you think, we've done our job.
These aren't just stories though, they're warnings, aren't they? They're lessons, and most importantly, they're voices that deserve to be heard.
If you've been affected by the issues discussed in this episode, please contact a local support service, because you're not alone.
We'd like to acknowledge the sources of the clips that you heard in this episode: Channel 4 News, Channel 5 News, the BBC and CNN.
The documentary Jimmy Savile, A British Horror Story is available on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, we recommend you watch it for more insights into the psychopathic paedophile's predatory behaviour.
Likewise, the BBC drama The Reckoning, about Savile's life and crimes, is available in the UK on the BBC iPlayer.
And if you've found this episode powerful or important, please help us keep going by subscribing to Psycho Killer wherever you get your podcasts.
And for bonus content, behind-the-scenes research and exclusive episodes, support us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/psychokiller.
That's patreon.com/psychokiller. No spaces, no mercy. I'm Simon Ford.
And I'm Jack Morrell.
Stay safe, stay sharp, and don't be fooled by the face in the mirror.
We'll see you again soon on the dark side for more Psycho Killer shocking true crime stories.